Welcome to Limerick Museum for this virtual tour. My name is Matthew Potter and I'm curator of Limerick Museum. I'll start with a little bit of history. Limerick Museum was established in 1907 and opened in 1916. It is a local authority museum wholly owned and financed by Limerick City and County Council. It has been situated in various locations around the city, but since 2017 has been housed here in the Old Franciscan Friary in Henry Street. The Old Franciscan Friary and the adjoining Franciscan Church were built between 1876 and 1886. The church was subsequently extended between 1928 and 1931. The Limerick Museum occupies the ground floor of the Old Franciscan Friary. The mission statement of the Limerick Museum is to collect, preserve and display objects and material culture relating to the history and heritage of Limerick City and County. Here in Limerick Museum, we try to tell the story of Limerick through its objects. So today I'm going to give you a brief history of Limerick through the objects here in Limerick Museum. The history of Limerick is as old as the history of Ireland. Human beings have lived in Ireland for 9,500 years, and indeed one of the earliest references to human habitation in Ireland comes from Castleconnell near Limerick City. In the 19th century, prehistoric time was divided into the three classic periods of Stone Age, Bronze Age and Iron Age, based on the materials that were predominantly used to make tools and everyday objects, as well as weaponry. In turn, the Stone Age has been divided into the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. Human beings only came to live in Ireland in the Mesolithic. One of the most important transitions in the history of Limerick and the history of Ireland was a transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic. In Mesolithic times, humans were hunters and gatherers. The Neolithic Revolution, which ushered in the Neolithic period, saw a transition to agriculture, when humans domesticated both animals and plants and began to settle in fixed settlements. This was one of the turning points in human history, and it ultimately led to the development of advanced civilizations such as we live in today. Here in Limerick, the period of the Mesolithic and the Neolithic saw the development of agricultural settlements throughout what is now the city and county of Limerick, but there were no towns or even villages. Another turning point was the arrival of the Celts around 500 BC, which coincided with the development of the Iron Age. From 432 onwards, according to tradition, Ireland was converted to Christianity, another turning point in our history. And there followed then a period known as the Early Christian Era, which lasted until approximately 795 AD. The actual history of Limerick City and Limerick County begun in the following period, which is the age of the Vikings. The Vikings first raided Ireland in 795 AD and then began to establish permanent settlements in Ireland, such as Dublin in 841 AD. The Vikings established Limerick City around 922 AD, so Limerick City is approximately 1100 years old. The Vikings controlled Limerick City for the next 250 years, albeit under the control of the local Gaelic kings of Munster. Then, in 1169, Ireland experienced another wave of invaders, the Anglo-Normans. They took permanent possession of Limerick City in 1195, displaced the Vikings, and established one of the most important buildings in the city, King John's Castle. This ushered in the period of the Middle Ages. Medieval Limerick, which can be dated from 1195 to around 1500, was characterised by the development of two cities in Limerick. The old Viking city became known as the English town. It was centred on St Mary's Cathedral, which had been established in 1168, just before the arrival of the Normans, and King John's Castle, which was constructed out of the orders of King John between 1200 and 1300. The The English town was the main area of settlement in Limerick City, but the Irish town adjoining it was the area where the Irish population generally lived. The whole of the city, the English town, the Irish town, which had an hourglass shaped figure, was surrounded by a wall approximately 3 miles in length, which enclosed a total area of about 57 acres. From 1500 onwards, Limerick and the rest of Ireland entered a period of more turbulence. The English crown asserted its control over the country more firmly than ever before, and under the Tudors, particularly King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, the whole of Ireland was brought under English control for the first time. By the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603, Limerick and the rest of Ireland were under direct English rule. From 1413 to 1603, Limerick had enjoyed a period of virtual independence because the English crown had not been able to control the areas outside the Pale, which is the area around the city of Dublin. But with the successes of the English government in the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, English rule had been extended over the entire country. However, this English control over the country was threatened on 2 occasions in the 17th century. The 17th century is the bloodiest and most brutal period in the whole of Irish history, and Limerick was no exception to this. From 1641 to 1653, English rule collapsed and had to be re-established by the severe and brutal campaign of Oliver Cromwell. Then from 1689 to 1691, English rule was again overthrown in Ireland when the Catholic King James II was overthrown and replaced by the Catholic King William III, King William of Orange. William of Orange led his forces to Ireland and reconquered the country between 1689 and 1691. Limerick was very central to these very brutal and bloody and turbulent events. In 1642, King John's castle was besieged and captured, and for the first time since 1195, the city passed out from under English control. Then in 1651, Oliver Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton, led a powerful army which besieged and captured Limerick after a 4-month encirclement. During the War of the Three Kings between 1688 and 1691, Limerick was besieged on 2 occasions, 1690 and 1691. And here we have an image of the 1690 siege. The city was garrisoned by a large Jacobite garrison. The Jacobites were the supporters of the Catholic King James II, headed by Patrick Sarsfield. The Williamite army was led by King William himself. The only time that a British monarch has ever come to Limerick. However, he did not come as a friendly visitor, but at the head of a hostile besieging army. Unfortunately for William, his attempts to capture the city were unsuccessful. When the walls were breached, the defenders of the city, including the women, drove back the Williamite army. The role of the women of Limerick in defending the city in 1690 has passed into legend, but in fact it was commonplace in the Middle Ages and early modern times for women to take part in the defence of their city or town. Here in the Limerick Museum we have a number of artefacts from this period, particularly 3 cannonballs that date to the sieges of 1651, 1690 and 1691. This is a romantic image of the siege of 1651, although the events it depicts are far from romantic. General Henry Ireton is the seated gentleman. He is condemning to death Bishop Terence Albert O'Brien of Emly, the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Emly. And of course part of the Cromwellian campaign was a severe persecution of the Catholic Church. So the unfortunate bishop was hanged, drawn and quartered, one of the most gruesome methods of execution known to mankind. After the turbulent 17th century came the peaceful 18th century, a penal age but also a golden age. It was a penal age because it was an age of Protestant ascendancy, The Anglican minority owned all of the land, controlled all of the cities and towns, governed the country without allowing Catholics any role whatsoever. The penal laws are designed to keep the Catholic majority population from becoming involved in the political process, from owning land, or from having any meaningful role in their own country. It was also, though, a golden age. For the first time in a century, arguably ever, Ireland enjoyed a prolonged period of peace. From the middle of the 18th century, there was great prosperity, and this Georgian period is fondly remembered as one of the golden ages of Irish art and architecture. Limerick City flourished during the Georgian period. The old medieval city, centred on the English town, the Irish town, was abandoned in favour of a grand new town, Newtown Perry, the present Georgian city, which was built between 1760 and 1840. Broad streets were laid out according to a gridiron pattern, similar to the great cities of the time such as Edinburgh, London, Bath and Brighton. The prosperity of Limerick in this golden Georgian age, from circa 1750 to circa 1815, is exemplified by the flourishing silver. Limerick silver's golden age was in the late 18th and early 19th century. And silver was a measure of the prosperity of Limerick, in the same manner, for example, as the sales of motor cars or houses can be used to gauge economic growth in modern times. So, for example, in 1700 there were only 10 goldsmiths or silversmiths in Limerick, but by 1800 the numbers had increased to 75. And also we have a great deal of the social history of the time from our wonderful collection of Limerick silver here, because we see sugar bowls, we see teapots, we see coffee pots, and of course this was the age when the colonial beverages, tea, coffee and hot chocolate, became widespread for the first time. Sugar, which had been introduced to Europe by the Crusaders, also became much more popular at this period with the growth of the flourishing, though slave-dominated sugar industry in the Caribbean. If Limerick silver was one of the great industries of 18th century and early 19th century Limerick, Limerick lace was one of the most important art and craft industries of 19th century Limerick. Limerick lace was founded in 1829 by Charles Walker, an English entrepreneur, and flourished until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. In its early decades, from 1829 to 1870, Limerick lace was based in a variety of factories in the city. Here at its peak, around 1851, some 1,800 women and young girls worked to make Limerick lace. Limerick lace is a hybrid lace in that the net that is used as the base is machine made, but the embroidery that was done on the net was done by hand. Hence it's known as a hybrid lace, partially machine made and partially handmade. Among the famous women to wear Limerick lace were Queen Victoria herself, Edith Roosevelt, the American First Lady from 1901 to 1909, and the revolutionary Countess Constance Markievicz. Limerick lace went into decline in the 1870s and early 1880s due to the flooding of the Irish market by machine-made lace from Nottingham. From 1883 onwards, Florence Fiore Bryan, an English philanthropist and entrepreneur who married into the local gentry, led a revival of Limerick lace. She established her famed Limerick Lace School in Limerick City from 1889 to 1922. Under her direction, Limerick lace enjoyed a revival, which ended in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War, which in turn resulted in lace going out of fashion. Limerick lace was not the only industry in 19th and 20th century Limerick. From 1820 to around 1970, Limerick enjoyed a period of industrial growth. It was not an industrial city like Belfast, where 75% of the workforce in 1911 were industrial. By contrast, in Limerick, 25% of the working population were employed in industry, so we could describe Limerick as a semi-industrial city. Saying that, the Industrial Revolution had a big impact on Limerick. The city had several factories. It had baking factories, it had clothing factories, it had tobacco factories, and in all of these factories, the signature features of the Industrial Revolution, such as time discipline, the separation between work and home, and the concentration of the workforce under one roof and in a strictly disciplined environment were to be found. This industrial age came to an end in the 1960s and 1970s when the indigenous industries that had developed over the previous 150 years were displaced by foreign direct investment. A contrast between the two periods was that during the period 1820 to 1970, most of Limerick's industry was based in the city centre. Thereafter, it was based in the suburbs or in Shannon Town. And also, the period 1820 to 1970 was a period of indigenous industries, whereas from the 1960s and 70s onwards, foreign direct investment dominated. Next, we look at the local government system in Limerick. Limerick City had been established by the Vikings, but the Normans founded this local government system in 1197, when the charter of that year provided for the establishment of a mayor and a city council. On the other hand, Limerick County was only established in the middle of the 13th century, around 1250. From the early 17th century to 1899, it was governed by the Grand Jury, a non-representative committee of landowners. But from 1899 until 2014, it was governed by a democratically elected county council. In 2014, Limerick City Council and Limerick County Council were amalgamated to form Limerick City and County Council, which currently governs the whole of Limerick. During its long 800-year history, Limerick City Council accumulated a fine collection of municipal regalia. For example, this magnificent neo-Celtic chair used by mayors of Limerick from 1997 until the middle of the 20th century. Here also we can see one of the 4 municipal maces created in 1739 in the reign of King George II, and the civic sword of 1575 given by Queen Elizabeth I herself to the Mayor of Limerick. The Freedom Boxes are another important legacy of Limerick City Council. In the 18th century, prominent figures who received the honorary freedom of the city were given this in silver boxes. Another important part of Limerick's rich and colourful past is its military heritage. Limerick's military tradition took 3 forms. First of all, there was the service of Limerick men in the armies of the great continental powers in the 18th century, the period of the wild geese. Thousands of Limerick men joined the armies of France, Spain, Austria and Russia, and many of them rose to high rank. In the 19th century, many thousands of Limerick men also fought in the American armed forces, particularly during the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. The second element of Limerick's military tradition was service with the British Armed Forces. which probably is exemplified by the role of the Royal Munster Fusiliers in Limerick's history. The Royal Munster Fusiliers was established in 1881 and abolished in 1922. Many thousands of Limerick men fought in the ranks of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, particularly in the Great Boer War of 1899 to 1902 and the First World War of 1914 to 1918. The third element in Limerick's military tradition is the fight for Irish freedom, particularly from 1916 to 1922. This is the uniform of Michael Collevitt, who was the commandant of the Irish Volunteers in Limerick City and County and Clare County at the time of the 1916 Rising. Although Limerick did not rise in 1916, many Limerick men fought in the Rising in Dublin, including Eamon de Valera, Con Colbert and Ned Daly. During the War of Independence from 1918 to 1921 and the Civil War of 1922 to 1923, Limerick was one of the major theatres of battle. This room is called our Cabinet of Curiosities. The first museums in early modern times were private institutions where kings and princes collected a wide variety of objects and displayed them in rooms that were known as Cabinets of Curiosities. These were of course not open to the public, but merely to an elite section of society. But one of the features of these Cabinets of Curiosities were that they didn't have any thematic arrangement. They were basically a collection of disparate objects. This is why we call this the Cabinet of Curiosities, because there's no theme for this room, but we are displaying here some of the most important items in our collection. Some of the items that are displayed here show the wide variety of crafts that were flourishing in Limerick in the 18th and 19th century. So, for example, there were clockmakers in Limerick, there were gunsmiths in Limerick, there were swords makers in Limerick. Limerick's wildlife is also well represented here in the museum. We have a fine collection of taxidermy, much of which was collected in the early years of the museum's existence. So, for example, flora and fauna are actually well displayed here in these wonderful dioramas which show animals and birds in their natural setting. However, perhaps one of the most iconic objects in the museum is not an example of taxidermy, but of a more peculiar tradition. This is Ireton's cat. It is a mummified cat dating from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. In early modern times, it was customary to place a dead cat in the walls of a newly constructed building for luck. The cat would already obviously have been deceased, but it was then subsequently mummified and arranged in an action position. This cat was placed within the walls of the house of the Galway family on Nicholas Street, which was Limerick's main street at this time, in the late 16th century. In 1651, when Henry Ireton captured the city, he took over the Galway residence. He only lived there for a month before he died, but the house was known subsequently as Ireton's house. When the house was demolished in 1894, the mummified cat was found within the walls. The cat was subsequently known as Ireton's cat. Having displayed in a shop window in Limerick City for a number of years, it was donated to the Limerick Museum in 1910. It's one of the most unusual objects in the museum and one of only a few such mummified animals in the entire country. The only other example of public display is the mummified cat and mouse in the crypt of Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin. And finally, this diving suit and accompanying pumping mechanism exemplify Limerick's long and proud maritime tradition. From 1823 to 1997, Limerick Harbour Commissioners governed Limerick Port. And this diving suit, which dates to 1949, was used by one of the staff of the Harbour Commissioners, who would be in the habit of diving underwater in Limerick Harbour to make sure that there were no impediments to shipping coming or going. That concludes our virtual tour of Limerick Museum. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope that you will be able to visit in person very soon. Thank you.